I wanted to go over the essay, specifically the argument essay, and go through two examples and then give you a third prompt for you to actually do and do on your own to kind of like practice and prepare. I think this is important to understand the argument essay. Just in general for the essays, if it says list, make sure you list something and just do that and just give a one-word answer, a one-sentence answer. If it says describe or to explain, you have to do more than one sentence. You have to give more information. An example. A lot of you might look at the rubric in the AP classroom and it says just one sentence. You need to give examples and describe, and please do that related to the prompt, related back to it. So please make sure you do that. If it says political parties, we have Democrats and Republicans. Use Democrats and Republicans in your example. If it asks, well, how would this hinder or how would this affect policymaking or lawmaking, explain it with specifics. Democrats control the House. Republicans control the Senate, the president controls the presidency. Use that example. If you're going to do a generic example like one party holds the Congress and the other party holds the president, still mention the political parties and give that example. So now we're going to go through the argument essay and we're going to go through all the different parts and what you need to do and then a couple of examples. So the first one is the framers believed that a constitution was necessary to create a stable political system that would protect individual rights. However, understanding the need for political change, they included a process to amend the Constitution. Develop an argument that takes the position on whether the process to amend the Constitution should be simplified. So, right here, that is what your argument is going to be. That's what you need to do, and you always need to go back to that part. You must use one of these pieces of evidence. You need to use Federalist 10, Brutus 1, and Article 5 of the Constitution. So in your essay, you have to use one of those. Now, your second part, you need to use another piece of evidence. You can use one of the other items you did not use in your first one, or you could use something else from your knowledge. So it says, respond to the prompt with a defensible claim or thesis. You need the thesis. If you don't have the thesis, basically you won't get any points. Support your claim with at least two pieces of specific, relevant evidence. One piece of evidence must come from one of the foundational documents listed above, the three. Second piece of evidence can come from any other foundational document not used in your first piece of evidence, or it may be from your knowledge of course concepts. The response accomplishes four of the tasks by a set of the question. For a student to earn points for C and D, or I put B, I do a different labeling. They must get point A and they must have the thesis part. So in this labeling part, task A is the thesis makes a defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning, whether the process to amend the Constitution should be simplified. So it's either yes or no, keep the same, make it harder. Examples could be the process to amend the Constitution should be made easier, as the Constitution is a living document that needs to adjust to modern day America. Process to amend the Constitution should stay as it is the framers deliberately made the process difficult to prevent changes by the whims of the people. Now, I always put in my thesis statement, put because. So make your statement because and give your reasons why. The next task, task B, is provide one piece of evidence from foundational documents that is listed that is accurately linked to the topic of the question. So in this, examples might be in the Federalist 10, Madison discusses factions and argues that representative government in a large republic is the way to solve factions. Brutus 1 fears the abuse of powers by a large federal government and favors having states retain more power. Article 5 of the Constitution outlines different processes that the framers created for the Constitution. So these are examples, but you need to link it to the topic of the question. You need to link it to the question. Task C is the response correctly supports the claim or thesis using that piece of evidence. So again, here you have to not only link it to the topic, you have to link it to the thesis and say this supports my claim. In Federalist 10, Madison warns of the dangers of factions. Since representative government has the potential to degenerate into conflicting factions, it is best that the framers created a process that makes it hard to change the Constitution. This prevents the Constitution from being changed because of the whim of the people. You're now supporting the thesis that the amending process should not be made simpler, it should not be made easier, it should be made the same or harder. Brutus I argues that the state government should have more power relative to the national government. The current amendment process works well because it grants the states power over the changes that are made to the Constitution. You need 3/4 of the states to approve any amendment. It prevents all the power from being amassed in the hands of the federal government. So then you would say this should be related to the thesis that the amending process should not be made simpler. Article 5 of the Constitution outlines the process for amending the Constitution. Framers deliberately instituted a system of checks and balances in the amendment process, so it would not be too easy to change the Constitution. Any proposed amendment by Congress must be approved and proposed by the states, thus making sure that the will of the people is reflected by every change. Related back to the thesis, this supports the argument to make the amending process simpler or keep it the same or make it harder. So task D, the response correctly supports the claim or thesis by using two pieces of relevant information. So you need another one that does the same thing. So you might say the Constitution is a living, breathing document. It needs to be made more flexible to address the political issues of modern day America. The current amendment process makes it too hard for good ideas, such as the equal right amendments, to be added to the Constitution because the number of states that are needed to approve any document. And then related to the thesis, it should be made simpler. One of the reasons the Constitution is the oldest document in the world is that its amending process allows for change, but that change is not made easily. It even allows bad amendments to be reversed, as the case with the 18th Amendment, which banned the sale of alcohol in the United States. The amendment process outlined in the Constitution allowed the 21st Amendment to be passed 14 years later, which overturned the 18th, and again, tie it to your thesis. The amending process should not be made simpler. It should stay the same or be harder. And then the last part, make sure you always do this, is refute the other side of the argument. Do this every time, even if it's not mentioned. It must be there. So in the last essay, most of you, if you watched the video, would have done it and did it or mentioned it. But others did not because you didn't see it in the prompt or in that part of it. Always refute it, do it, even if it's not mentioned. So I listed in the argument, basically the rubric, A is your thesis. B1 is the label, it's the first piece of evidence. Explain the evidence and tie it to the prompt. B2 is my label, it's the first piece of evidence, supports the thesis. B3 is the second piece of evidence and tie it to the prompt. C is the label for the second piece of evidence, supports the thesis. D is the refute, the argue the other side. And then you're done. And then you have all of your parts. So in that essay, I'm just going to read the essay and I'm going to show it to you. Go ahead and follow along on this. Today's world is so different from the 18th century. The founding fathers had no idea what the 21st century would look like, and to judge our laws and our society based on the 18th century norms and ideas is unthinkable. Today we have AR-15s, bump stocks, social media, the internet, high-speed travel, instant information. This is so different from the world in the 18th century. The founders could not comprehend our world. The process to amend the Constitution should be simplified and made easier because the Constitution is a living document that needs to adjust to modern-day America. And it will increase the number of good ideas plus reduce the number of informal changes to the Constitution. So the amending process needs to be simplified because you want to increase the number of good ideas, reduce the number of informal changes to the Constitution. Article 5 is the foundation document. So that's the one that's required. Article 5 of the Constitution outlines different processes the framers created for amending the Constitution. In the original Articles of Confederation, it took all 13 states to agree to an amendment to the Articles. This process in Article 5 is easier, but we have had only 27 amendments. I believe the founders would be shocked that only 27 amendments have been made to the Constitution, but this process should be simplified and easier. I put easier, but I think it should be simplified and easier. Many amendments have passed 2/3 of Congress vote, but they have died a long death afterwards. They have not been ratified. The requirement of 3/4 of the state legislatures and 3/4 states conventions to stop the flag-burning amendment, which has 90% approval rating, the ERA amendment, which 60% of the people and 37 states have already passed, plus 100 more amendments have died in the ratification process. The amendment process needs to be made simpler and easier. So I related these to the prompt, and I related this one. The amendment process needs to be made simpler and easier. The Constitution is a living document. It's changed over the years, but most of the time it is through informal changes, not formal amendments. Political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution and frowned on with the Federalist 10 about factions. We have political parties today, and they're essential to the Electoral College, electing the president, committees, and passing laws, congressional structure, and offices. This was not done by amendment, but by informal means, which is not really following the Constitution. It would be very difficult today to add an amendment today, including political parties in all aspects of government. This amendment would never pass. The constitutional amendment process should be simpler and easier to follow to allow for changes to our government with political parties and not to be done by the informal process. So I basically had the amending for Article 5. I had the Federalist 10. I mentioned informal process. So I had my two pieces of evidence, and now I'm looking at the refutation. Brutus I would not like the amendment process to be made easier, and he wants the states to have more power and be able to stop amendments. Making the amendment process harder has increased the informal changes to the Constitution, which I believe Brutus would think was terrible and unconstitutional. Today, more things are done informally than formally. So if we had an easier method of changing the Constitution, more amendments would be passed legally and less informal amendments would be done. There would not be an increase in poor amendments. It is hard to pass laws now. The amendment process obviously would be harder. The process to amending the Constitution should be made simpler and easier as it stopped good popular amendments and will decrease the use of informal amendments. So that's the argument that I put. I had the two pieces of relevant information. I had the refutation part. Now we're going to look at another example. The United States Constitution establishes a federal system of government. Under federalism, policymaking is shared between state and national governments. Over time, the powers of the national government have increased relative to the state governments. So develop an argument about whether the expanded powers of the national government benefits or hinders policymaking. So again, you need to use one of the documents. The documents is Articles of Confederation, Brutus I, or Federalist 10. You must have a thesis. You must support your claim with two pieces of accurate and relevant information. One piece must come from one of the three documents. The second piece can come from the other documents not used or something else from your knowledge of course concepts. Use reasoning to explain why your evidence supports your thesis and claim. So you need to remember, support your claim and thesis, and then respond to an opposing alternative perspective using refutation, concession, rebuttal. You got to remember to do that every single time. So remember, you have 6 tasks with this. To earn a point for B1, B2, C, and D, you need to have the thesis first, so you must have the thesis. So task A, the thesis makes a defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning about whether the expanded powers of national government benefits or hinders policymaking. That is your thesis. B1, provide one piece of evidence that is accurately linked to the topic question. B2, one piece of evidence that you used in B1 supports your argument, supports the thesis. B3 is a new piece of evidence that is actually linked to the topic question. C is one piece of evidence that supports the argument or thesis, so you need to go back and use the second piece and then refute the other side. So make sure to have all those parts. Make sure to always tie it to the prompt, bring it back to the thesis, refute the other side. So here is my example. The U.S. has already tried giving states more power than the national government, and it has proved to be ineffective and a disaster. With Shays' rebellion, states bickering, laws not getting passed, and the country in chaos, the federal government had to expand powers. The expanded powers of the national government benefits policymaking because the Articles of Confederation were too weak and ineffective, and new executive branch would be efficient and improve policymaking. So I'm using the Articles of Confederation, and I'm going to be using the executive branch in a Federalist paper. The Articles of Confederation are a prime example of why a strong national government is better. With the Articles, the government could do very little. It made the states more independent by allowing them their own currency, impose their own taxes. The Articles of Confederation made it harder to pass laws because each state had very different agendas, and it required over a majority of them to agree. To amend, it required unanimous decision. This makes it nearly impossible to enact an amendment to change a policy. Expanding powers of the federal government benefits policymaking by making and creating laws easier than the Articles of Confederation. This makes so that needs to be worded a little bit better, but it benefits public policy making where creating laws is easier than the Articles of Confederation. According to Federalist 70, a strong executive benefits the country because it's easier for one person than a group to make decisions, and someone is held accountable. This efficiency and accountability from a strong executive benefits policymaking. This strong executive is important to expanding the powers of federal government to improve policymaking ability through executing the laws and creating executive orders. Again, you need to tie it to the thesis, tie it to the prompt. Some people may argue that the federal government is too large and that states are best suited to address the needs of the people without interference from the federal government. However, this is not true. The state governments are not equipped to handle all of the problems they face without the federal government. Today, states cannot handle the COVID-19 crisis, and they're going bankrupt without the help and safety net of the federal government. The federal government can act with uniformity to affect all states to ensure everyone is guaranteed the same protections as everyone else. Expanding powers of the federal government benefits and improves policymaking. So in this one, it's probably terribly written. It's probably one of the worst ones. There's probably typos. There's errors with it. But I have the piece of evidence. I tied it to the prompt. I tied it to the thesis. Second piece of evidence, tied it to the prompt, tied it to the thesis. And then I had the refutation that said basically here were the problems with the past, with the Articles of Confederation, and then having the expanding powers is benefits policymaking. So I had all the parts. So even if it's not even well written, remember you have to have that. I always, like the other essay, other video showed, always have your thesis statement with it because, and those because would be your two reasons that you're going to be looking at. One will be one document, one would be the other document or the other item. Remember, please link to the prompt, please link to the thesis and support the thesis and make sure it supports. So here is your extra credit or your point of your essay. As part of the blueprint for checks and balances, the United States Constitution outlines a procedure for Congress to impeach and remove public officials, including the President of the U.S. Develop an argument whether the congressional procedure outlined in the Constitution for impeachment and removal is an effective check on the President, too weak a check on the President, or too strong a check on the President. So you need to make an argument. So is it effective, too weak, too strong? Use at least one piece of evidence from Brutus 1, Federalist 51, Federalist 70. And then you need two pieces of evidence, so you can do either one of the other pieces of documents, or you could use something else from your knowledge. Also remember to respond to an opposing alternative perspective using refutation, concession, rebuttal. So that is the sample that I would like, the essay that I would like you to do. You can turn that in within the next week after me posting this. And then I definitely think you should practice this, and I'm going to have some more practicing with the essays. I'm also going to have you practice with a constructive essay, but I'm not going to have one that you can look up the answers. I want to make sure you get it in your knowledge and make sure that you have examples. Thanks a lot, and give me any questions at office hours or at the bottom of this video or any comments.